So the short-lived Javier Báez era is over as he has signed a 6-year, $140 million deal with the Detroit Tigers. But on today's episode of Locked On Mets, I'm going to explain why signing Max Scherzer erases the mistake that was trading Pete Crow-Armstrong for Javi Báez at the trade deadline.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, Javier Báez has signed with the Detroit Tigers, which means the Mets gave up Pete Crow-Armstrong, one of their top prospects, for only 2 months of his services. But on today's show, I'm going to explain why that mistake could have been made much worse had they pursued Max Scherzer at the deadline. And now the fact that they've signed Scherzer, it has really erased that mistake with Báez. In the first segment, I'll detail how these two really are related. In the second segment, I'll talk about what would have been different had the Mets landed Scherzer at the deadline. And then finally, I will look forward to the Mets' next era of baseball past Báez, what they should do at second base, and really why they're in a much better position than we would have thought, considering how that trade really has gone sideways based on the prospect that they gave up. But before we get to any of that, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com, where I did just write an article about this exact topic that will go live on Wednesday. And basically, the purpose of the article and the purpose of this podcast is to explain that the Mets were not necessarily in the right by making that trade. They were not managed properly by trading for Javi Báez. I'm not trying to excuse that trade now as a good decision by the franchise, because clearly in retrospect, as we play the game of hindsight being 2020, it wasn't a good call to trade for Javi Báez. But we have to understand all the circumstances that led to that trade. And that's the fact that Mets fans at the time had watched a first place team hold the division down for months and were desperate for reinforcements. And one of the most prominent Mets fans, actually the most prominent Mets fan, is sitting atop the organization, Steve Cohen. Steve Cohen is the biggest Mets fan of all, and he is running this team. And any notion that he is not involved in baseball operations has been proven false at this point. We know that Steve Cohen is very involved, maybe not with the day-to-day, but certainly the big days, the trade deadline, free agency. Steve Cohen is making decisions and impacting what the Mets do. And it has worked out in this period of spending right now because you can flex that financial muscle and acquire a Max Scherzer. But at the deadline, what you're dealing in is not capital, it's prospects. That is the problem. And Steve Cohen was in Zach Scott's ear pushing for a trade for Javi Báez. And also before that, for a trade to acquire Max Scherzer. He had his eyes set on Max Scherzer at the deadline. But Max Scherzer would not decline that no trade clause to go to the Mets. He was not going to pitch for the Mets in their push to make the playoffs last season. And ultimately, that proves to be the Mets' saving grace in all of this. Because had the Mets been given that green light to negotiate on a Max Scherzer trade, Mike Rizzo, the Nationals GM, would have the Mets over a barrel. And he would have absolutely fleeced them. Absolutely fleeced them. Negotiating against a rookie GM in Zach Scott, who had Steve Cohen in his ear, or would have had Steve Cohen in his ear, pushing to get a deal done at whatever cost. And that would have been an extremely dangerous proposition. When Zach Scott spoke about the Javi Báez trade at the time, I could just tell by the way he was selling it that this was not something he was completely bought in on. I really don't think that Zach Scott, when it comes to just evaluating baseball, is a bad mind. I actually think he's really talented when it just comes to the analytics, the evaluating of players, I think he actually knows what he's doing. And I think if it was up to Zach Scott, the Mets would have just sat on their hands. I've said that before, and I really believe that. I don't think that he looked at all the trades that were available to him at the deadline, and I don't think he liked anything. I really don't. I think he knew the Mets farm system was in a bad position, and he did not want to trade from that farm system. But you have the owner pushing for trades. You have the fan base pushing for trades. So what does Zach Scott do? Well, I'm going to trade Pete Crow-Armstrong, a prospect that is obviously very highly regarded, but that is the only prospects the Mets had that were coveted. They didn't have any mid-tier prospects that other teams wanted. It's a top-heavy farm system. So if you're not going to trade Alvarez, if you're not going to trade Vientos, Beatty, Ginn, if you're not going to trade any of those guys, Matt Allen, then you look at Pete Crow-Armstrong and say, all right, we just drafted him. He's far away. He just had a really significant shoulder injury. That was the player to trade. So he uses that one chip, a single chip, gets some pitching depth in Trevor Williams, who is still under team control, by the way. The last holdover of the Báez trade now, unless he gets non-tendered. And by the way, I will discuss non-tenders later on this week. Robert Gsellman did get non-tendered. That's the only thing that's been reported at this point as I'm recording at around 7:30. So we'll talk about that later in the week. But getting back to this trade, he gives up Pete Crow-Armstrong, gets Trevor Williams and Javier Báez. Javier Báez was awesome. You could not be any better than Javier Báez was as a trade deadline acquisition. But one player wasn't going to do it. That trade appeased the fan base, appeased the owner. But unless the rest of the team around that single piece performed, the Mets were doomed, and we saw it, a huge second half collapse. But would Max Scherzer have really changed their fortunes? Would Max Scherzer alone have changed the tides for a team that finished, it was 18 games under 500 from August on? Hell no. He would not. One player, I understand how great Max Scherzer is. I get it. But Javi Baez was out there every day, and he couldn't solve the problem. And the problem most of the times was the offense. So imagine what could have happened differently. Imagine if you had traded for Max Scherzer, and who knows, maybe even traded for Javi Baez too. Where would the Mets have been? And then even worse off, if you make that trade, now Max Scherzer would have been sitting on a Mets team that was losing time and again, that just continued to lose. Would they have been able to sign him? Had he been on the team? I'm going to talk about what would have been different had the Mets been allowed to negotiate a Max Scherzer trade at the deadline, and how much of a worse position they could be in, and why the Mets are very fortunate moving forward that Billy Epler is in charge and maybe helping Steve Cohen not make such hasty decisions in the future. This holiday season, grab the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, or even better than a candy bar. Built Bar is filled with so much holiday goodness, rich with decadent flavor and covered in chocolate, but amazingly low in calories, low in sugar, net carbs, and fat, but high in protein. So you get the best of both worlds, delicious and healthy. So many flavors to choose from, whether it is the raspberry, mint brownie, cherry, double chocolate, my personal favorite, cookies and cream. And Built Bar gives you that extra fuel you need to bust down those mall doors and battle all the holiday shoppers. Or if you're just standing in an endless line, Built Bar can give you that extra something to keep you going. So throw one in your jacket or purse. You never know when you're going to need it. And here's a special secret. You want to cozy up with something warm? Here's what you got to do. Dip that Built Bar in a piping hot cup of cocoa and let it melt a little bit. That'll give your beverage a little bit of that Built Bar flavor. Plus, you'll have a nice melty Built Bar to go with it. Be sure to have a couple napkins on hand if you choose that one. But if you want to try Built Bars today, go to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, so let's continue to take a trip down the hypothetical highway and talk about what could have been different had the Mets been allowed to negotiate and trade for Max Scherzer. As I said, Rizzo would have had a field day trying to talk a Scherzer trade with the New York Mets at the deadline, knowing that the Mets would have desperately wanted Scherzer. If Steve Cohen knows that Scherzer wants to be a Met, or is at least willing to be a Met, now he's saying, all right, well, we can have him long term. We can trade for him. We can give him the big contract. We're going to keep him. And obviously, Scherzer has been the apple of Cohen's eye, as we just saw him give the guy $130 million over 3 years. So imagine you're in those talks. And let's just say Pete Crow-Armstrong is still the prospect that goes out. So we're just going to swap, Max Scherzer for Javier Báez in this situation. But the caveat, if Mike Rizzo knows all of this, and Rizzo's one of the most experienced GMs in the game, he's going to say, Steve, to get this deal done, I got all this deferred money down the road. Scherzer's going to be on your books. It's fine. Why don't you do me a favor? Eat $5 million a year over the next 7 years, as we're paying him $15 million a year in deferrals. Steve Cohen's like, man, $35 million for Max Scherzer. I'm going to pay him a boatload anyway. Who cares? We're going to win a World Series. Let's do it. He's going to replace Jacob deGrom. Everything's fixed. Let's go, 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 go. All right, well, now you do that. Now you make that mistake. Not only are you, for one, trading Pete Crow-Armstrong to a division rival, you're easing their financial burden of having to pay Max Scherzer 7 years after he's gone. They just got a bargain for that entire 7-year contract, paying him essentially half of the money over the first 7 and then half of the money later. One of the crazy stats I just found today looking through Scherzer's contract is that by the end of the 2024 season, the Nationals will have paid Max Scherzer $155 million. The Mets, by the end of the 2024 season, will have paid Max Scherzer $130. Only $25 million less in 3 years as the Nationals would have paid in 10 years. It's crazy. But I really think that's a realistic outcome that could have played out had the Mets been allowed to negotiate a Max Scherzer trade at the deadline. Then Scherzer's on a terrible Mets team in the second half and says, I want no part of this moving forward. Get me the hell out of here. And if that's the case, now you're left holding the bag on that money. You gave up your prospect. And where do you stand? So I know this is a lot of hypotheticals and playing things out. We don't know how anything would have worked out. And who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one trade, Scherzer just changes the dynamics in that clubhouse. Suddenly that Mets team that was terrible in the second half, the other 25 guys react better to Scherzer than Báez being there, and the Mets go on a run and they win the World Series. I just strongly doubt that would have happened. And I think that your chances of signing Max Scherzer, had you got him at the deadline, would have been far slimmer than what they ultimately ended up being as the Mets got Scherzer as a free agent. And with all that said, this is where the Mets had to learn their lesson. Because right now, what Billy Epler is doing, in my opinion, is very smart. I have laid it out before. I'll lay it out again. He said it at the introductory press conference. This is what he tried to do with the Angels. He wants to build the Mets with short-term, big money free agents, have a bloated payroll early as you build out your farm system. That is where you can create your competitive advantage. The Mets can essentially have a rebuild window of the next 3 years while they're just having this incredible bloated payroll of $300 million on the field trying to win, while you are actually rebuilding the farm system methodically, not trading from it, not gutting yourself time and again. That's what the Mets are trying to do right now. To have a great draft, they can really shorten that time frame of getting that farm system where they need it to be. But in the meantime, the Mets have that luxury because of Steve Cohen's pocketbook to continue to contend. They need to be as aggressive as possible, as they just were during free agent periods, and also using their ability to take on salary and trades without giving up the prospect return. And I think Billy Epler is the GM now that has the experience, that has the cachet around the league, that he's not going to get bent over a barrel when he's negotiating with Rizzo. That is what I believe. So if it was Billy Epler sitting in that seat at the deadline trying to negotiate a Scherzer trade, he could have said, hey, we'll eat that deferred money, but we're taking a huge burden away from your owner. We're not giving you anything back. And that could have been a trade that would have made a lot of sense. The Mets giving up a minimal prospect return, but eating a ton of money to get Max Scherzer at the deadline. That would have made sense. But I think because of Zach Scott being a novice GM at the time, that wasn't possible. So now that you have an experienced GM making moves, I think Steve Cohen can actually be utilized at his best as an owner, and these sides can work together and really help the Mets grow the right way moving forward. That's why, as we move on now to talk about what the Mets do after Javier Báez, I think they made the right call because they could have doubled down on a mistake and given Javi Báez a 6-year deal, but then they're hamstringing their future. They're tying themselves to Báez and Lindor when Lindor just had a bad year, and then Báez has a bad year. Now everything's going sideways, and you are left trying to dig yourself out of another hole. The Mets were smart. They let Báez get his long-term deal elsewhere. And now, because of that, yes, they lost Pete Crow-Armstrong, but they just got Max Scherzer, which allows them this 3-year period where he can buoy a rotation that is in desperate need of reinforcements from the minor leagues that aren't coming just yet. So now you have a 3-year window with hopefully DeGrom and Max Scherzer where you can go out, draft, develop, and get new pitchers that will be cheaper when you get past the 2024 season. That's the plan that the Mets are trying to accomplish now, and I think they're on the right track. But what we're going to talk about next is what they do now that Javi Báez is a Tiger and second base is vacant. BetOnline has you covered all season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football season continues to march towards the playoffs. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this season. Head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit just by using the promo code Locked On. From basketball to football, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on your favorite sports. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, so how do the Mets go about replacing Javi Báez? I would make the argument that they just did. They just signed Starling Marte, Eduardo Escobar, and Mark Canha, 3 position players that are going to be a huge boost to their lineup. They're losing Conforto and Báez. They're gaining Canha, Marte, and Escobar. To me, that is close to getting the Mets lineup where it needs to be. Obviously, you still would like to see the Mets add a little bit, but there is this notion out there that they don't have a starting second baseman right now. And to me, that's not the case. Jeff McNeil is perfectly fine to be your starting second baseman. And I spent today just trying to defend the poor guy on social media, but I can't really do that too much. It's a losing battle on Twitter. For any of you who go on there, you can try to make your point, but a lot of times it's falling on deaf ears. You're not going to get your point across to a Mets fan that just looks at Jeff McNeil and says he sucks because he sucked last year. And all we can remember is what just happened. And the thing that drives me nuts about it is the argument is talking about Javi Báez like he's some consistent player. Have you been watching him his entire career? I guess you've been watching McNeil, but if you have been watching McNeil, you would have seen 3 above average offensive seasons to start off his career and a good track record in the minors, as opposed to Javi Báez, who has been up and down his whole career. Now, I'm not trying to go straight comparison for comparison and say that McNeil's a better player than Javi Báez. What I will say is when you're talking about Báez getting paid $20 million more than Jeff McNeil, hell yes, he's a better player when it comes to the contract and the production that he can give you on that contract. And there's people who just want to DFA Jeff McNeil because of one bad year. Trade him. He's got a bad attitude. He's cocky. He's arrogant. He's blah, 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 blah. If you want to win, okay, you have to ignore some of that stuff. You have to put any of those personality clashes and check them out the door. You need to talk to Francisco Lindor, who's supposed to be a leader, and say, look, we're trying to build a winning ball club. And right now, the best value second baseman that we can have starting for this team is Jeff McNeil. Point blank, period. It's that simple. And I want us to just really take a step back, okay? Because yes, he had a bad year. He hit 251, 319 on base, 360 slugging. I did an entire podcast criticizing Jeff McNeil that you can find on YouTube under the playlist Top 10 Most Disappointing Aspects of the 2021 season, where Jeff McNeil was certainly one of the biggest disappointments. I'm not going to let him off the hook for a bad year, but what I will say is even with that terrible season, which he did deal with a significant hamstring injury that I think did hurt him a lot, but if you even look at that season and then you just look at his career numbers, still a career 299 hitter, gets on base at a 364 clip, 459 slugging percentage. His WRC plus, which is weighted runs created plus, measuring a league hitter based on an average of 100 is 126. So he is 26% better than your league average hitter throughout his career. You want to know where Javi Báez stacks up throughout his career? His WRC plus is 103, only 3% better than a league average hitter, because his strikeout profile is so bad that really does impact what he provides your team. Yes, Baez gives you the home runs, and that's awesome. And at times, trust me, I have advocated for maybe that's a combination of Brian and Baez. What Baez brings to your team, I think, does go beyond some of these advanced metrics. He's one of those players that has a great impact with his energy, the defense he brings you, the base running. I'm not trying to make Baez out to be a bad player, but all I'm saying is when you're talking about giving Baez a 6-year deal with his inconsistencies and that ridiculous strikeout profile where he's striking out almost 30% of the time throughout his career, you really want to sign that and be tied to it long term? Because I know this guy, Chris Davis, who was in Baltimore, who had a similar swing and miss profile, and that did not age very well. So you're talking about McNeil under team control, still a better offensive player throughout his career than Javi Baez is. And also, you look at the individual seasons. I had somebody comment on my post today that said that even at his best, Jeff McNeil isn't half as good as Javi Baez. Well, let's go through the numbers again real quick. 2019, when he was at his best, Jeff McNeil hit 318, 384 on base, 531 slugging percentage. His WRC plus was 144, 44% better than your league average hitter, and an identical number than what Pete Alonso put up that same season when he hit 53 home runs. That's how good Jeff McNeil is at his best. He's going to get on base a ton. He's going to hit for a high average, maybe compete for batting titles at his best. And also, he has 3 seasons in his career. His rookie season, 2019, and the shortened season, his first 3 seasons, of posting a WRC plus above 130. Javi Baez only has 1 his career year in 2018. So this notion that Jeff McNeil can't play second base or is a bad player to be your starting second baseman, it is patently false. Jeff McNeil also, when it comes to defense, was worth 4 outs above average at second base in 2021. Well above average defensively. And also, for what it's worth, he's posted above average defensive metrics when it comes to defensive runs saved at left field, right field, second base, and third base in his career. I don't know where people are coming up with this narrative that Jeff McNeil is bad defensively. Maybe because his name starts with a J and JD Davis starts with a J. They're getting those two guys confused. I don't know. But Jeff McNeil is a good defensive player that brings great versatility to your ball club. If, let's just say, Nimmo goes down, because he has gone down before, and Starling Marte has to be your starting center fielder, and you got to play Robinson Cano at second base because Jeff McNeil has to slide into left field, you have coverage. So when I look at this team right now, Jeff McNeil as your starting second baseman is fine. The only player that's out there right now that I would want as opposed to Jeff McNeil as the starting second baseman would be if the Mets were to call up the Guardians now and trade for Jose Ramirez, whether that's to play Ramirez at third base or second with Escobar playing in the other spot. That's the one player that is likely available on the trade block that I'm interested in. I don't want to sign Chris Bryant to a $200+ million contract over 7 years because, for one, he was not great after the trade deadline. For two, that does not go with the plan the Mets are trying to accomplish right now. They're not trying to tie themselves to these players on long-term deals. So in the short term, Jeff McNeil for the next 2 years, perfectly fine. And I think that is the direction the Mets are going to go. It seems like they're pretty happy with their position core or position player core right now to the moves they've made. Maybe you make another signing. Jonathan VR, hold up. I didn't quite throw it out. Oh, it's back. It's back. We still got the VR jersey. We still got it. We still got it. Maybe we bring this man back. I don't know. Maybe if he's cheap enough. It's depth, but he's out there. And there's other similar signs you could make to add another bat to your bench. But I think right now, between Eduardo Escobar, Robinson Cano, and Jeff McNeil, it might not be the flashiest group, but the Mets have coverage to at least go into the season. And as I've said, if things are not working out and Mark Vientos doesn't show up and he's not an impact player, whatever it ends up being, and you are in a position where your team is so damn good and the only hole in your roster is second base, that's the only thing holding you back, then that's when you might have to say, all right, we're going to have to change the plan up because we have one hole that we have to solve. Let's get a new second baseman in here. But I really don't think Jeff McNeil is going to have the same season. I think he's going to be a lot better next year. I think the Mets are fine missing out on Javier Báez. This team just made a ton of additions, and I think Mets fans really need to take a deep breath and remember where you were a week ago, where you are now, and how much of a better position the Mets are in. Folks, they still got Max Scherzer. I think I'm going to close every single episode with, hey, the Mets have Scherzer throughout the rest of the offseason because it is just so much fun to say. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's episode of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Locked On Bets is the place to go for your daily gambling needs. You can follow Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.